step into the shadows of history, where secrets, scandals, and forbidden stories come alive. In the comments below, tell us, which city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. Elijah had learned early that a man could be owned on paper and still refuse ownership in his mind. That refusal did not make life easier. It made it sharper. Every sound carried meaning. Every delay mattered. Every choice rippled outward toward consequences that rarely touched only him. By the time the hunters marked him for capture, he was no longer thinking about himself at all. He was thinking about what would happen to his child if he failed. Fatherhood under bondage was an exercise in contradiction. A father was expected to protect, but protection was a luxury denied by law. He was expected to provide, but everything he produced belonged to someone else. He was expected to teach obedience, even as obedience destroyed dignity. Elijah lived inside those contradictions daily, navigating them with care so practiced it appeared like resignation to those who watched him casually. Those who knew him better understood something else. He listened more than he spoke. He watched the land the way other men watched faces. He noticed changes that passed unnoticed by those who believed themselves in control. He did not rush. He did not boast. Men like Elijah survived not by challenging power openly, but by understanding its blind spots. His child was young enough to believe in him without question. That belief was both burden and strength. It meant Elijah could not afford recklessness. It also meant he could not afford surrender. Every night he lay awake calculating futures that never included safety but demanded survival anyway. He imagined routes. He imagined hiding places. He imagined the sound of dogs long before he ever heard them behind him. The plantation where he lived functioned like many others. It presented order as inevitability. Routines were enforced not just through violence but through repetition. People moved where they were told. Time was measured by bells and commands. The system worked best when no one believed alternatives existed. Elijah had never fully accepted that premise. He had learned things quietly, the way forbidden knowledge is always learned, through observation, through whispers, through moments passed down like fragile objects never named directly. Hoodoo was not spoken of openly, it did not need to be. It lived in habits, in small rituals, in respect for forces older than ownership. It was not magic as the hunters imagined it. It was understanding layered with belief, belief sharpened by survival. Elijah did not see hoodoo as weaponry, he saw it as alignment. Alignment with the land, with ancestors who had endured worse and still found ways to breathe, with patterns that existed long before men claimed dominion over soil and bodies. This knowledge did not make him fearless. It made him prepared. The moment he decided to run was not dramatic. It came after a small thing, the way decisions that change everything often do. A look lingered too long. A comment carried too much threat. A future closed in sharply enough that calculation replaced patience. He understood then that staying meant his child would be taken from him eventually, sold or broken or erased. Leaving meant risk, but risk carried possibility. The hunters did not see Elijah as exceptional. That was their mistake. To them, he was a problem to be solved, a body to be returned, an example to be made. They believed fear would do the work for them. Fear had always done the work for them. When his absence was discovered, reaction followed a familiar pattern. Anger first, then confidence. Orders were given. Dogs were prepared. Men spoke of the hunt as if outcome were already settled. They framed it as routine, as labor no different for any other task. That framing protected them from doubt. They spoke of Elijah as if he were already caught. What they did not understand was that Elijah had been preparing for this long before they imagined it necessary. He had not prepared with weapons or allies, he had prepared with attention. He knew which paths men avoided because they were inconvenient. He knew where water broke scent and where it carried it too cleanly. He knew which areas unsettled dogs, not because of superstition, but because animals reacted to changes humans dismissed. He also knew fear, not the fear that paralyzes, but the fear that clarifies, fear that narrows focus until only what matters remains. His child mattered. Everything else was negotiable. The hunters took their time at first. They always did when confidence ran high. They joked as they mounted. They laughed about how far a man with responsibilities could really go. They trusted dogs more than thought. Dogs had never failed them before. Elijah moved differently from the start. He did not run blindly. He did not rush into the unknown. He guided his child carefully, conserving energy, choosing paths that looked wrong to those who valued speed over sense. He understood that the chase would not be won by distance alone. It would be won by direction. As the sounds of pursuit grew closer, Elijah did something that would later be described as superstition by those who needed an explanation that did not involve intelligence. He paused briefly. He touched the ground. He whispered words that were not spells in the theatrical sense, but acknowledgments. A request for alignment rather than intervention. He did not ask the land to fight for him. He asked it to recognize him. Belief matters not because it bends reality, but because it sharpens resolve. Elijah rose from that pause steady rather than frantic. He moved with intention rather than panic. Panic betrays patterns. Intention creates them. The hunters felt the shift before they could name it. Dogs behaved strangely, not disobedient, but uncertain. Scent wavered. The chase lost its clean lines. Confidence thinned slightly, then more. Men compensated by pushing harder, by trusting force to overcome confusion. Force rarely adapts well. Elijah had chosen a route that intersected with memory. Places where stories lingered, where people had vanished before, where survival had been negotiated quietly for generations. To the hunters, these were just inconvenient stretches of land. To Elijah, they were known. The chase intensified as frustration replaced amusement. Voices sharpened. Commands grew louder. Dogs surged, then hesitated. The hunters dismissed hesitation as error rather than warning. They did not believe the land could choose sides. They had never needed to. Elijah did not look back often. Looking back invites hesitation. He listened instead. He listened to changes in sound, to howls altering pitch, to shouts overlapping without coordination. He knew then that the pursuit was no longer clean. That knowledge mattered more than speed. When the hunters finally reached the place where Elijah had decided the chase would unravel, they did not recognize it as such. Recognition requires humility. They had none to spare. They followed momentum into terrain that resisted it. They trusted dogs into ground that punished instinct. They brought weapons into spaces where weapons were irrelevant. What followed would later be described as bad luck, as strange coincidence, as superstition run wild. None of those explanations captured what actually occurred. The land did not attack them. It simply refused to cooperate. Dogs lost footing, men slipped, coordination fractured. Anger replaced confidence entirely. In that chaos, Elijah widened distance quietly. He did not need the hunters to fail completely. He needed them to hesitate long enough. By the time they regrouped, breathless and shaken, the trail no longer spoke clearly. Scent scattered, direction blurred. What had felt inevitable now felt uncertain. Hunters do not tolerate uncertainty well. It turns purpose inward. Elijah moved on, his child held close, his body aching, his mind focused. He did not believe himself saved yet. He believed only that he had survived this moment. Survival was always moment to moment. Behind him, the story had already begun to change. Men would speak of Hoodoo because Hoodoo absolved them of responsibility. Hoodoo made failure external. Hoodoo allowed them to mock what they did not understand rather than confront how easily certainty had betrayed them. They would never speak of Elijah as a father making calculation under pressure. They would never frame him as intelligent or deliberate. Those descriptions threatened the hierarchy too directly. It was safer to invoke darkness and mystery. Elijah did not care what they called it. He cared only that his child breathed beside him, that the land continued to open and close as he needed it to, that fear no longer sat solely on his shoulders. He had shared it now. He had handed it back. This was not the end of the escape. It was the beginning of disappearance. Disappearance was not absence. It was strategy. It was refusal made quiet enough to survive. Long after the hunters abandoned the chase, long after the dogs were leashed and the story written, the truth remained where official history would never look closely. A father had been marked for capture. A system had assumed obedience. Knowledge, belief, and attention had answered instead, and somewhere beyond the reach of certainty, Elijah continued moving forward, carrying not magic but memory, responsibility, and a refusal strong enough to bend the path beneath his feet. The hunters did not call it obsession at first. They called it routine. Routine was comforting. Routine suggested control. It implied that whatever had slipped out of place would soon be returned to order. When word spread that Elijah had fled, the initial response followed a script written long before any of the men involved were born. Horses were readied, dogs were fed and leashed. Weapons were checked more out of habit than necessity. The tone was casual, almost bored. This was not their first hunt, and they did not expect it to be memorable. They spoke of Elijah as if he were already caught. That certainty shaped everything that followed. It slowed them at the beginning, when urgency might have mattered. It allowed jokes to fill the air where planning should have been. Men laughed about a father thinking he could outrun dogs while carrying a child. They framed his escape as desperation rather than calculation. Desperation in their minds always ended the same way. What they did not understand was that desperation had already passed for Elijah. He was operating from clarity now. The hunters began by following the most obvious signs. Broken brush, disturbed earth, a trail that looked intentionally clear. They congratulated themselves on how easy it seemed. Ease reassured them. Ease suggested the world was still behaving properly. Dogs moved confidently, noses low, bodies taut with excitement. The men trusted the dogs completely. They always had. As hours passed, something subtle shifted, not enough to alarm them, but enough to irritate. The trail bent toward terrain they disliked, ground that slowed horses, paths that required dismounting. They grumbled but pressed on. Slowing down felt like concession. Concession was unthinkable. The hunt began to stretch longer than expected. Confidence thinned, not into fear yet, but into impatience. Impatience is dangerous. It pushes people to override signals they would otherwise heed. Elijah counted on that. The land changed character gradually. Trees grew closer together. Underbrush thickened. Sound behaved differently. Commands echoed strangely, returning distorted. Dogs surged forward, then hesitated, then surged again. Handlers dismissed this as temporary confusion. They urged the dogs harder, tightening leashes when possible, releasing them when not. They did not pause to reassess. The obsession began quietly, the way it always does. It emerged not from fear of losing Elijah, but from offense. A man like him was not supposed to complicate their work. Each delay felt like insult. Each hesitation by the dogs felt like betrayal. The hunt was no longer about retrieval. It was about restoring authority. They spoke less as time went on. Conversation narrowed into commands and curses. The easy laughter from earlier evaporated. Sweat replaced amusement. Men who had joked about entertainment now focused grimly on distance and direction. The hunt had become personal. Elijah listened to all of this without seeing it. He did not need to see it. Sound carried enough information. Changes in rhythm told him how close they were. Changes in tone told him how frustrated. He adjusted accordingly, guiding his movement to keep pressure at exactly the level he needed, not enough to force full retreat, not enough to invite fresh planning. He let them believe they were gaining ground. The hunters mistook proximity for success. They believed closing distance meant inevitable capture. They did not consider that proximity could be manipulated. Elijah allowed scent to remain clean longer than instinct demanded. He crossed water where it helped him, not where it erased everything. He wanted the dogs confident. Confidence would carry them where caution would not. As the chase lengthened, exhaustion crept in. Not the kind that stops movement, but the kind that dulls judgment. Men drank from flasks too quickly. Horses were pushed past comfort. Dogs strained harder than training loud. The pursuit began consuming resources at a pace no one had planned for. Still, they pressed on. This was the moment obsession fully took hold. Turning back would have meant admitting miscalculation. Admitting miscalculation would have meant acknowledging Elijah as something other than prey. The idea was intolerable. They reframed the difficulty in darker terms. Some muttered about tricks, others about unnatural luck. Someone mentioned hoodoo half-jokingly at first, then with less humor. The word carried weight not because they believed in it, but because it explained discomfort without demanding self-examination. Belief, for them, functioned defensively. Elijah felt the shift even without hearing the words spoken. Fear had entered the hunt, not his own, but theirs. Fear makes people loud. It makes them reckless. It makes them cling to explanations that absolve them of responsibility. Elijah adjusted again, tightening the sequence, narrowing options. He moved toward the place he had chosen long before, a convergence of ground, water, and confusion. He did not rush. Rushing would have betrayed his intent. He moved with the same steady urgency that had carried him from the start. Pain flared. He acknowledged it and moved through it. Pain was not new. Panic was behind him. The hunt unraveled further. Dogs began losing coordination. Their howls overlapped without pattern. Handlers shouted conflicting commands. Horses balked at footing. The land resisted speed, turning momentum into danger. Obsession sharpened rather than softened. The men pressed harder, convinced that force would break whatever resistance they were encountering. Force had always worked before. That belief was difficult to surrender. They did not see that the hunt itself had changed character. It was no longer linear. It was folding in on itself, compressing space and time. Every choice they made narrowed options rather than expanding them. When they reached the edge of the terrain Elijah had selected as the turning point, none of them recognized it as such. Recognition requires humility. Obsession leaves no room for it. Dogs surged forward without hesitation. Men followed, breathless, driven by the need to end what had already cost too much. The land responded exactly as Elijah knew it would, not violently, not dramatically, but decisively. The hunt broke apart in pieces. A stumble here, a fall there. Confusion spreading faster than command. Obsession turned inward, feeding panic rather than focus. The dogs, confidence shattered. The men's certainty followed. Elijah widened distance carefully, never assuming safety prematurely. He did not celebrate. Celebration invites mistakes. He focused on disappearance rather than victory. Distance accumulated quietly, step by step, until the sounds behind him shifted from pursuit to management. By the time the hunters understood that the chase had become something else entirely, it was already over. They would later describe it as strange, as unnatural, as cursed. These words protected their pride. They did not describe it as miscalculation. They did not describe it as being led. Elijah did not need them to understand. He needed them to stop. And when they finally did, when obsession burned itself out into exhaustion and doubt, he continued moving forward, his child still breathing beside him, the land opening and closing as needed. The chase had become an obsession. An obsession had destroyed itself. What remained was distance, silence, and the beginning of something far more dangerous to the system than escape. Uncertainty. By the third day of pursuit, the hunters were no longer chasing a man. They were chasing an explanation. What unsettled them most was not distance, but inconsistency. The land refused to behave the way it always had. Trails appeared strong and then dissolved. Scent held where it should have scattered and scattered where it should have held. Dogs that had never failed hesitated, circled, doubled back, then surged forward again with misplaced confidence. None of this fit the rules the hunters relied on to make sense of the world. When rules fail, people reach for belief. It began as a mutter, half joking and dismissive. Someone said the ground felt wrong. Another laughed it off, saying swamps did that to men who did know better. Then a handler swore the dogs had lifted their heads at the same place twice, as if scent had vanished mid-step. A third mentioned how the wind kept shifting against expectation. None of these observations were alarming on their own. Together, they formed a pattern the hunters did not want to acknowledge. Someone said the word hoodoo aloud for the first time without laughter. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Hoodoo was not something they respected, but it was something they feared just enough to mock when confidence ran high. Now confidence had thinned. Mockery felt risky. The word offered a way to explain discomfort without admitting error. Hoodoo, to them, meant darkness. It meant trickery. It meant forces they did not control. Most importantly, it meant the problem was not their own judgment. The problem was external, supernatural, unfair. This framing changed the hunt. Fear sharpened, but did not clarify. It narrowed thinking. Hunters became louder, more aggressive, less strategic. They began to interpret every obstacle as confirmation of interference. A twisted ankle became a sign. A coughing fit became a warning. A dog, hesitation became proof of manipulation rather than training limits. Elijah felt the shift before he understood its language. He sensed it in the way pursuit grew uneven. The hunters were no longer moving with coordinated purpose. Their sounds carried strain. Commands overlapped, shouts lost direction. Fear had entered their bodies, and fear makes people noisy. He adjusted accordingly. Elijah had never thought of hoodoo as spectacle. There were no gestures meant to impress, no dramatic acts designed to intimidate. What he carried was quieter and older than fear. It lived in attentiveness, in respect for balance, in the belief that survival required relationship rather than domination. He had learned from elders who never taught directly. They taught through caution, through story fragments, through the repetition of what worked. They taught that the land remembers those who listen to it, that water carries knowledge, that animals respond not to force alone but to intention. None of this was mystical to Elijah. It was practical. Before crossing certain places, he paused. not long enough to waste time, but long enough to orient himself. He adjusted what he carried, what he left behind, what he allowed to touch the ground. These actions were not spells. They were acknowledgments. They aligned him with the path rather than against it. Belief shaped behavior. Behavior shaped outcome. The hunters interpreted this alignment as manipulation because manipulation fit their worldview. They believed power functioned through dominance. If they felt dominated, something must be fighting back. The idea that they were fighting themselves was unacceptable. As fear deepened, the hunt fractured. Some men urged retreat, arguing that the chase had become dangerous beyond its worth. Others pressed forward harder, determined to crush whatever resistance embarrassed them. Division replaced coordination. Division slowed movement. Elijah welcomed it. Dogs suffered most under this confusion. Handlers pulled them in conflicting directions, shouted commands that contradicted instinct, punished hesitation, and encouraged recklessness simultaneously. The dogs' confidence collapsed under pressure. Where once they moved as a unit, now they reacted individually, responding to noise rather than scent. Elijah did not rely on dogs failing entirely. He relied on them failing inconsistently. He guided his movement through spaces that encouraged this inconsistency. He crossed water not to erase scent completely, but to break it into pieces. He chose areas where wind shifted unpredictably, where ground texture changed abruptly. Each choice multiplied confusion rather than eliminating trail outright. Confusion requires time to resolve. Time was his ally. The hunters, increasingly convinced of Hoodoo's presence, began making errors born of superstition. Some refused to step into certain areas. Others rushed through them recklessly, believing speed would break influence. A few began carrying charms or muttering prayers meant to protect rather than guide. Protection without understanding rarely works. Elijah felt none of this as triumph. He felt it as responsibility. He could not afford to believe the chase was over simply because fear had entered the other side. Fear makes people unpredictable. Unpredictability can be dangerous. He stayed disciplined. When exhaustion pressed in, he slowed slightly rather than pushing harder. Collapse would end everything. He rested only where cover allowed it. He drank sparingly. He adjusted his child as weight carefully, preserving strength without sacrificing pace. The land gave him what it could. He took only what was necessary. Behind him, the hunters argued. They argued about direction, about dogs, about whether to continue. Anger flared. Accusations surfaced. Someone blamed the handler. Someone blamed the terrain. Someone blamed Hoodoo outright, suggesting they were no longer hunting a man but an influence. That suggestion both frightened and relieved them. If Hoodoo was involved, failure did not mean incompetence. This belief justified withdrawal. As night fell, the hunt lost cohesion entirely. Fires were lit too early, revealing positions rather than hiding them. Guards were posted unevenly. Sleep came fitfully, fractured by noise and fear. Dogs whimpered, unsettled by inconsistent handling and strange ground. No one slept deeply. Elijah moved during those hours, quietly widening distance. Darkness favored him because he understood it as condition rather than obstacle. He did not rush. He did not wander. He followed memory, not sight. When dawn came again, the hunt resumed out of obligation rather than confidence. Men moved because stopping felt like defeat. But their steps were cautious now, their voices subdued. The dogs responded sluggishly, energy drained by confusion and fatigue. Hoodoo had become explanation enough. They told themselves the land was against them. They told themselves Elijah had helped beyond what they could see. They did not tell themselves they had misjudged him. They did not tell themselves they had been arrogant. Elijah sensed when pursuit finally shifted from intent to hope. Hope that they might stumble upon him by chance rather than did not rely on assistance openly. He relied on discretion. The hunters slowed further. Some turned back outright. Others lingered, unwilling to admit the chase had ended, but unable to continue the conviction. The dogs were leashed more often than released. Fear had fully replaced certainty. In their retellings later, Hoodoo would grow larger. It would become explanation, warning, excuse. They would speak of strange winds, of animals behaving unnaturally, of ground that swallowed men whole. They would not speak of miscalculation. They would not speak of intelligence. Hoodoo would protect their pride. For Elijah, belief had done its work differently. It had anchored him rather than distracted him. It had sharpened focus rather than scattered it. It had reminded him that survival was not about overpowering pursuit, but about dissolving it. By the time the last hunter abandoned the trail, Elijah was already somewhere else entirely. Not safe yet, not finished, but no longer chased. He did not mark the moment with relief. Relief is loud. He marked it with silence. The escape was no longer about outrunning men and dogs. It was about disappearing from the story they needed to tell. Hoodoo had given them a story that allowed that disappearance to stand. Elijah did not correct it. He let them keep their fear. And he carried forward something quieter and far more enduring, the knowledge that belief, when aligned with attention, can bend outcomes without ever needing spectacle. The hunters had chased a father. They had met something they did not understand. And in trying to name it, they had lost him completely. By the time the hunters realized the chase had changed shape, they were already inside it. What unsettled them now was not speed or distance, but reversal. The land no longer responded to them the way it always had. Paths narrowed unexpectedly. Clearings opened where they should not have. Water appeared in places marked dry on memory alone. It was not that the forest had transformed. It was that they had stopped understanding it. They tried to reassert control the only way they knew how, by force. Dogs were released again with sharper commands. Men pushed harder, voices raised, tempers fraying. When dogs hesitated, handlers punished them. When footing failed, men blamed the ground. When coordination fractured, they shouted louder. Each attempt to dominate only deepened the disorder. Elijah felt the shift as a loosening behind him. Not an end, but a fray. The pursuit no longer pressed with unified purpose. It came in waves, bursts of noise, followed by stretches of confusion. This told him something important. The hunters were no longer thinking together. Division had set in. Division is opportunity. He moved toward places where the land demanded agreement to navigate safely, narrow crossings, uneven banks, ground that punished misstep. In these places, coordination mattered more than strength. He knew the hunters would struggle there because they had never needed to negotiate with the land. They expected it to yield. It did not. At a shallow crossing, dogs surged forward as they always did, confident and loud. The water was not deep, but it was deceptive. Beneath the surface, the ground sloped unevenly, slick with silt. Elijah crossed carefully, placing his feet where resistance felt right, where balance held. He slowed just enough to keep scent intact, then climbed out at an angle that scattered it unpredictably. Behind him, the dogs hit the water too fast. Momentum betrayed them. Legs slipped. Bodies collided. One dog scrambled, regained footing, then lost it again as another slammed into its side. Handlers shouted conflicting commands from opposite banks. The noise spiked, sharp and panicked. A hunter stepped in to regain control and went down hard, water splashing up around him, rifle clattering uselessly. Another rushed to help and nearly fell as well. The crossing became chaos, too shallow to drown, too unstable to control. It was not deadly. It was humiliating. Humiliation cuts deeper than injury. Elijah widened the distance quietly, moving into thicker ground where water and earth blurred together. He did not need the hunters to fail completely. He needed them to lose confidence in their own movement. Confidence, once broken, does not repair quickly. The dogs were pulled back eventually, wet and agitated, energy spent in confusion rather than pursuit. Handlers argued about what had gone wrong. Some blamed the dogs. Others blamed the crossing. One man muttered again about Hoodoo, this time without irony. The word spread faster now. It offered explanation where understanding failed. It gave shape to fear without requiring responsibility. If Hoodoo was involved, then failure was not weakness, it was misfortune. The idea settled into the group unevenly, but once it did, it began to guide behavior. Men avoided certain areas now, not consciously at first, but instinctively. Paths that felt wrong were bypassed even when they offered advantage. Dogs were hesitated over rather than released freely. Weapons were handled more carefully, as if care itself could ward off influence. Fear had become selective. Elijah sensed the hesitation and adjusted again. He moved toward the spaces they avoided, not because they were mystical, but because fear made them inaccessible. Fear narrows options. Narrowed options simplify escape. He paused briefly in a place he had chosen long ago, a bend in the land where sound carried strangely and wind shifted direction without warning. He did not perform. He did not dramatize. He did what he had always done, acknowledged the ground, adjusted his load, and moved on. The pause was practical, not ceremonial. But belief does not require ceremony to take hold. Behind him, the hunters argued openly now. Some wanted to continue, driven by anger and embarrassment. Others wanted to turn back, claiming the chase had become unsafe, unprofitable, or cursed. Leadership fractured. Authority, once assumed, was contested. Every minute spent arguing widened the gap Elijah needed. They pressed on again, but the rhythm was gone. Dogs were released cautiously, then pulled back quickly. Men advanced, then hesitated, then advanced again. The chase lurched rather than flowed. Each misstep reinforced the belief that something unseen was working against them. The land did not need to act. It needed only to remain indifferent. Elijah felt exhaustion settle deeper into his body now, the kind that does not announce itself sharply but seeps into muscles and breath. He managed it the way he always had, by listening. He adjusted pace, redistributed weight, rested in motion rather than stopping fully. His child remained quiet, as if sensing the need for stillness. That silence mattered. As evening approached, the hunters faced a choice they did not want to name. Continuing meant navigating unfamiliar ground under failing light with shaken confidence and exhausted dogs. Turning back meant admitting the hunt had defeated them. They compromised, which satisfied no one. They pressed forward a little longer, hoping for chance rather than strategy. Chance rarely favors those who rely on it. Dogs wandered off trail more often. Men tripped over routes they would normally avoid. Frustration curdled into fear. When one dog refused to advance into a stand of trees the men believed Elijah had passed through, panic spiked. Dogs do not refuse without reason. The refusal was interpreted as warning rather than training limitation. Hoodoo was no longer whispered. It was spoken openly. Someone suggested stopping for the night. Someone else agreed too quickly. Fires were lit earlier than necessary, signaling presence rather than hiding it. Guards were posted unevenly. Sleep came in fragments, disturbed by unfamiliar sounds that now felt intentional. Elijah moved during those hours. He did not move far, but far enough. Darkness favored him because he understood it as condition rather than threat. He followed memory rather than sight, choosing routes he could walk without seeing clearly. Each step increased separation not just in distance, but in understanding. By morning, the hunters, resolve had thinned into obligation. They resumed the chase because abandoning it felt worse than continuing, not because they believed in success. Dogs were sluggish. Men were quieter. The land felt hostile simply because it no longer felt obedient. The final unraveling did not come with drama. It came with consensus. One by one, men acknowledged what none wanted to say aloud, that the chase was no longer worth it, that risk outweighed reward, that the story could be reframed as strange misfortune rather than failure. This agreement did not require formal declaration. It emerged naturally the way surrender often does. They turned back without ceremony. Elijah did not witness the moment. He felt it indirectly, in the way sound behind him thinned and then vanished, in the way tension lifted slightly from his shoulders without leaving entirely. He did not assume safety. He assumed only that pursuit had ended. For the hunters, the land had turned against them. For Elijah, the land had simply refused to cooperate with arrogance. Later, when the story was told, Hoodoo would grow larger than it had ever been in reality. It would become dark magic, curses, unseen hands. These embellishments served a purpose. They protected pride. They preserved hierarchy. They allowed men to believe the world was still predictable if only such forces were absent. Elijah did not correct them. He understood that belief, once established, could be more effective than truth. Their fear would keep them from following him further. Their story would close the door he needed closed. As he moved deeper into places where names changed and memory protected itself, he carried no sense of triumph. He carried responsibility. Responsibility for his child. Responsibility for staying unseen. Responsibility for continuing to choose patience over speed, attention over force. The chase had not ended because of magic. It had ended because arrogance had limits, and Elijah, who had lived his life learning to move within limits imposed by others, had finally found the edge where those limits collapsed under their own weight. By the time the hunters finally abandoned the chase, they did so without admitting it to themselves or to anyone else. Retreat was reframed as pause. Failure was renamed prudence. Pride does not surrender cleanly. It dissolves into excuses. They returned the way they had come, slower than before, quieter, with fewer jokes and more glances over shoulders. Dogs were kept close now, leashed more tightly than usual, as if proximity could restore confidence. Men avoided certain stretches of land instinctively, even when those paths were shorter. No one said why. Everyone understood. What lingered was not anger anymore. It was unease. That unease followed them back into familiar spaces. Around fires and tables, the story was retold carefully, edited with each tang. Details were adjusted. Moments of confusion became moments of bad luck. Hesitation became caution, and always, hovering at the edges of the narrative, was Hoodoo spoken now not as joke, but as explanation. Hoodoo did important work for them. It transformed embarrassment into mystery. It allowed men who believed themselves masters of land and bodies to accept that something external, not error, not arrogance, had intervened. Hoodoo made failure survivable. It preserved hierarchy by locating power somewhere dark and unknowable rather than within the man they had hunted. The story hardened quickly. It spread beyond those who had been present, gaining weight as it suited everyone involved. Those who told the story felt safer believing they had encountered something unnatural. Those who listened felt warned without being challenged. No one had to confront the possibility that intelligence, patience, and preparation had undone them. Elijah became legend without consent. He did not know how his name traveled, only that it did. He sensed it in the way people reacted when he passed through certain places, in the careful looks, in the sudden offers of food without question, in the warnings given quietly, indirectly, never spoken plainly. Stories had reached ahead of him. That attention was dangerous. He adjusted again, changing routes, altering names, letting distance do what speed could not. He did not linger where recognition sharpened too quickly. Recognition invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites capture. His child remained close, quieter now, shaped by movement and silence rather than stability. Elijah watched carefully for fear in those small movements, adjusting pace and presence to keep panic from settling. Fear in children spreads faster than in adults. It must be managed gently. They moved through spaces where survival depended on discretion, places where people understood why some questions should not be asked, where help was given without explanation and forgotten without record. These networks were fragile, sustained by trust rather than visibility. Elijah treated them with care. Behind him, the hunters tried to restore routine. They returned to other work, other hunts, other assurances of control, but something had shifted. Dogs were handled differently. Terrain was approached with more caution. Confidence carried an edge of restraint it had never needed before. They did not speak openly of Elijah again, but they remembered. Memories difficult to erase when it unsettles certainty. The idea that a man unarmed, burdened, injured had led them into confusion lingered like grit under skin. They reassured themselves by enlarging Hoodoo in the retelling. The darker the magic, the smaller the man needed to be. This distortion preserved comfort. Elijah did not challenge it. He understood something they did not. Belief is not only something people hold, it is something that holds them. The belief that Hoodoo had intervened would keep them from following him further. It would keep them cautious where once they had been reckless. It would keep the story contained. Containment was safety. As time passed, the story became less precise and more symbolic. Elijah's name shifted. Details blurred. What remained consistent was the warning. Some hunts ended badly, some land resisted. Some men vanished. Hoodoo was blamed when certainty failed. The truth that systems break when arrogance outruns attention was never spoken. Elijah settled eventually into a life that did not announce itself. Safety, for him, did not mean comfort. It meant obscurity. It meant days that looked like labor but belonged to no master. It meant nights without bells or commands. It meant raising his child in quiet spaces where names mattered less than trust. He did not think of himself as having won anything. Winning suggests conclusion. His life did not offer that luxury. It offered continuation. What he carried forward was not magic, but memory of how easily power mistook confidence for inevitability, of how belief could be turned inward against those who wielded it carelessly, of how patience, sharpened by fear and responsibility, could dismantle pursuit without spectacle. The hunters never caught him. They caught a story instead, and that story, darkened and distorted by fear, did more to protect Elijah than any weapon ever could. What remained after the chase ended was not resolution, but residue. The hunters returned to their routines, but routine no longer sat comfortably on their shoulders. Something had been disrupted that could not be fully repaired. They continued to work, to hunt, to command, yet the certainty that once animated those actions had thinned. They moved through familiar spaces with a new caution, an awareness they did not name openly. The land once assumed obedient now carried memory. Officially, nothing remarkable had happened. No reports recorded a failed hunt. No ledgers marked Elijah's escape as significant. Systems survive by refusing to document what challenges them. Silence in this way becomes policy. Unofficially, the story traveled. It traveled along paths that avoided paper and ink. It moved through whispered warnings and half-told anecdotes. It settled into places where memory mattered more than accuracy. Each retelling reshaped it slightly, emphasizing fear over fact, mystery over method. Elijah's name faded in some versions, replaced by archetype. A father, a runner, a presence. Hoodoo grew larger as the man grew smaller. That imbalance was intentional. The story functioned better that way. By transforming Elijah into something unknowable, the hunters protected their worldview. They could not accept that a man they believed inferior had outthought them. They could accept that something dark and unseen had intervened. Hoodoo in their telling became explanation, warning, and excuse all at once. Among the enslaved, the story did different work. It was not told to frighten. It was told to remind. It circulated quietly, stripped of exaggeration, grounded in meaning rather than spectacle. The emphasis was not on magic, but on preparation, not on fear, but on patience, not on domination, but on alignment. Elijah's escape became proof not that supernatural forces would always intervene, but that attention could alter outcomes. That belief, when rooted in understanding rather than desperation, could bend circumstances. That systems built on arrogance collapse when forced to adapt. Elijah himself did not become part of the story. He avoided places where his name surfaced too clearly. Safety demanded distance from legend. He understood that attention, even reverent attention, could be fatal. So he kept moving, letting time do what speed could not. He found work where questions were few and loyalty was quiet. He learned new rhythms, new names, new ways of measuring days. His child grew within those rhythms, shaped by movement rather than confinement, by caution rather than fear. The world remained dangerous, but it was no longer defined by immediate pursuit. Elijah never believed himself untouchable. That belief belonged to men who had never needed to be careful. He believed instead in continued vigilance, in adapting before necessity demanded it, in listening more than speaking. These habits had saved him once. They would need to save him again. As years passed, the hunt receded into memory, but not into irrelevance. The hunters who had participated spoke of it less often. Silence replaced storytelling. Silence, too, can signal discomfort. New hunters heard fragments without context, warnings without explanation. They learned which stretches of land were avoided, which stories ended abruptly. Fear remained, unexamined. The land did not remember the hunter's victory or defeat. It remembered it as disturbance, and then, as it always does, it absorbed that disturbance back into itself. Trees grew where ground had been torn. Water settled where panic had churned it. The forest did not commemorate. It endured. History, when written later, would not mention Elijah. Or if it did, it would do so obliquely, as rumor, as superstition, as folklore unworthy of serious consideration. That omission was not oversight. It was design. Official narratives cannot accommodate stories that reveal how fragile power truly is. But history is not the only keeper of truth. Truth persists in behavior, in caution passed down, in choices made quietly, in routes avoided, in beliefs adjusted. Elijah's escape altered more than his own fate. It altered how fear circulated. He had taken fear that belonged exclusively to the hunted and redistributed it. Not evenly, not permanently, but enough to matter. The hunters learned that dominance could be resisted without confrontation, that intelligence could masquerade as weakness, that belief, when misunderstood, could work against them. These lessons unsettled more than open rebellion ever could have. Elijah did not consider himself a symbol. Symbols invite fixation. He considered himself a father who had done what was required. Survival rarely feels heroic to those living it. It feels practical, necessary, exhausting. When he thought of the chase at all, he did so without triumph. He thought instead of how easily it could have failed, of how small decisions had mattered, of how close fear had come to undoing everything. This awareness kept him sharp. The world did not change because of his escape. Systems remained. Chains persisted. Violence continued. Elijah knew this. He did not mistake his survival for revolution. But survival is not insignificant. It creates cracks. It introduces doubt. It offers alternative endings where none were supposed to exist. That was Elijah's legacy, whether named or not. He had refused the ending written for him.